and welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival and today's lunchtime conversation with author Simon Conway and me, Lee Randall. Let me start with the housekeeping. If you have a question for our author, please feel free. You can use YouTube or Facebook and possibly even Twitter, and we'll try to get to some of those at the end of what is a slightly shorter event because it's your lunch hour. There are buttons and links all over the place where you can buy all of our authors' books, and especially Simon's book, which we'll be talking about. And there's also a link where you can donate to the festival if it's within your means, and you can help keep events like this coming. So let me introduce our author. Simon is a former British Army officer and international aid worker who currently works as the Director of Capability for the Halo Trust. Now that's a charity that removes the debris of war and especially landmines around the world. He's had an international childhood which included time spent living in Lebanon and Thailand. He saw active duty in the British Army, after which he spent 4 years in the Peak District and then on Isla. And he has a connection to the local area, living not that far away from Wigtown itself. When he was on Isla, he wrote his first novel, Damage. Now that won the literary review. Sorry, I have now completely bollocksed this up, so I'm just going to go back and tell you that his first novel, Damage, was described by the literary review as a debut of a roaring and prodigal talent. And then in 2010, he won the CWA's Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award for A Loyal Spy. So his new novel, which I will not mess up, is called The Stranger. It's a fast-paced thriller, and it finds MI6 agent Jude Lyon in a race against time to get to the bottom of a plot to launch a devastating act of terrorism on the UK. It tackles a number of timely issues, including rendition, the radicalisation of young British Muslims, refugee camps, government cover-ups, and terrorism. The action takes us from London to Syria to Jordan, back to the English capital, and pits Jude against a really, really frightening evil genius who's rigidly focused on carrying out his horrible and deadly plans. So, welcome, Simon. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for such a good introduction.
Well, parts of it were good. Parts of it I have to apologize for the rest of the day. I wanted to ask you a sort of general question to kick off, because whenever I read a spy novel, it reminds me that in addition to all the things we know the government is doing, there's a hell of a lot of paddling underwater, like the mad ducks and swans, who look so serene on the top. And I'm wondering, having had the jobs you've held, you're privy to a lot of this paddling underwater. How has that helped inform your books, and especially this book?
Well, where I'm fortunate in that my job with Halo involves setting up new programs, getting into new places, and during the course of the last 5 years, I've predominantly been in the Middle East, so Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and I'm on my way to Libya. I should be in there by Sunday, visa permitting. But so I've been involved in these places at these times, during and post conflict, and getting into them, often at the same time as our intelligence services themselves have been trying to sort of find out what's going on or learn what's going on. So in a sense, I'm privy to the same kind of information, or some of the same kind of information. Obviously, I'm not privy to any kind of communication intercepts, but the ground truth often, actually, I have a better sense of than these people, just because having the kind of access that I do, and I suppose possibly because my organisation has a sort of greater appetite for risk often than government departments do. And I actively, in my role working for an NGO, I have to be quite careful about not associating too much with intelligence officers, and so one does come across people now and then, but you kind of, it's quite careful to maintain a distance, frankly. But obviously a sort of distance where you're watching what's going on. Mm-hmm. Interest for my evening and weekend job, writing books.
Yeah. Some of this book, and I'm going to ask you to maybe sketch out a little bit more than I did of the plot, but some of this book has been inspired by true events, hasn't it? Such as the rendition section and things like that.
Yeah. So the book opens with a man called Nasruddin al-Raqqa, who is a suspect in a really devastating attack that happened in Basra in 2004 that results in the death of 25 British servicemen. And Nasruddin has been, and the book opens with there's two faxes, two redacted faxes for the reader to see, and they refer to the rendition of Raqqa, of Nasruddin. Nasruddin is picked up in Karachi and rendered to Damascus because back at that time, the Assad regime was considered to be our friends. It was glasnost in Damascus, I think is how I decided it. How I described it. And Assad was a gentle orthodontist with a British wife, and of course he's turned out to be one of the great brutal murderers of the century. But Nasruddin rendered and then broken out. He's broken out. So the book opens with this terrorist suspect being broken out of a Syrian interrogation center where he spent 10 years in the basement, and he's broken out by a gang who've been doing prison breaks across Iraq and Syria, and then selling the prisoners that they free, they sell them onto Islamic State, who then utilize them. So, and this is all to do, this is the sort of thing that goes on, or there was going on, certainly in the height of Islamic State control of Iraq and Syria. There were marauding gangs breaking people out of government prisons and selling them on to the jihadis. So I tried to sort of work on that basis. And the actual rendition of Nasruddin and his wife, who in the book is 7 months pregnant, it parallels a real rendition, which was Abdul Haq Belhaj and his pregnant wife, Fatima Bouchard, who were rendered from Bangkok to Tripoli and Libya. So it has echoes of a real event. And that real rendition ended up with the Prime Minister, Theresa May, apologising to Belhaj and his wife for what was, essentially an illegal act when there was no real evidence that Belhaj was responsible for any terrorist crimes. And without giving too much away of my book, similarly, it becomes clear that Nasruddin is a pawn in a much larger game.
Yeah. Very early in the book, Jude meets a gym owner who talks him through some of the circumstances that make vulnerable British Muslims ripe for the plucking by people who want to radicalize them. Can you talk us through some of those circumstances, please?
Yeah, and obviously what I've gone on is sometimes spent in some of these areas, but mostly on the work of other people, both academic work and journalists who've spent time in some of these communities where, largely these are essentially we're talking about post-industrial communities where there is very little job opportunity. Often there are very fractured populations, so there are, people are very divided by race and ethnicity. There are very little opportunities, as I've said, and then there are some of the kind of issues within, I think, that are cultural that often prevent young men and women intermixing in a way, and then there is this sort of atmosphere and I don't want to overstate it, but there are clearly elements of extremist thought that can strike a chord with disaffected particularly young men. Young men who feel, and usually, often there's a trigger. There's some kind of disrespect that's been shown to them, and it might be by the police or it might be whoever else, but that gets these young men to just feel that there isn't really anything, there's nothing here for them to believe in this country, and often these are second or third generation. These are they're as British as me and you and whoever, and yet they don't, they feel disaffected, and so and then you've got these, for a while, these pipelines of people going through Turkey into Syria, for instance. And I follow one individual that was based sort of loosely on a real story about a young man who ended up as a suicide bomber in Syria, who actually couldn't speak Arabic, so he didn't really know what was going on around him, and he started off helping out in a refugee camp, and he ends up on a video giving a very tongue-tied last words before he then drives a truck bomb into one of these prisons that ends up with a prison break, and you just get that sense that this was a young, vulnerable man who really, on some level, didn't really quite understand what he was doing. Or if he did understand what he was doing, he didn't have people around him that were able to say, don't do this. Guy set off with the hope of helping children in refugee camps who ends up blowing himself up. Something's gone wrong there, I think.
Yeah. One of the things that while I was reading this, you get very invested. I got very invested in Jude and what would happen to him. And the book seemed to close in on me. I got a sense of extreme claustrophobia, that here was a man who couldn't trust anyone, because his life depended on it. And one has that sense about spy books, is that the world closes down even while you're out in the world. And is that something that is just endemic with the job? Is that what the job is like?
Well,
I know you said you're not a spy.
Yeah, I'm not, and I think to some extent that's a device of the genre.
Yeah.
I mean, it's my intention to make it tense and claustrophobic.
Okay.
And I like, I've always liked the kind of nuances of not really knowing who you can trust. But it's certainly true that we live in this remarkable time when we have this all-powerful technology, when we really don't have any idea who's listening in to what we do, and we all know from the amount of spam that we get and attempts by people to get our information off us that it's not just governments that are monitoring what we're doing, it's criminal gangs and everyone else, and they're just they're throwing those nets very widely and trying to hoover everything up. And I think that, yes, the more you think about that, and then of course I'm the subject matter I'm writing. I think claustrophobia and tension are sort of, they're the results, and certainly they are what I'm aiming for.
Well, victory on that score. The other thing, sort of the other side of that coin for me was also, one has these tremendous bursts of adrenaline. The amount of cortisol and adrenaline that must go through on both sides of the equation. And I'm just wondering what that does to a person. And certainly, I don't know if your military background can shed any light on that either. I mean, living with that at such a high level for so long.
Yes, I think we all try to find coping strategies for how you deal with that, but it's certainly, I would say, it does take a toll on Jude, on Jude Lyon, who's the central character, and he has his own, he has his obligatory counsellor who he can talk to, although he trusts her as little as I think she trusts him. He spends most of his time sort of obfuscating, but I think in the case of Jude, he's found a sort of some degree of peace within, physical activity. He does a martial art, and that gives him something. And then also he's by training he's an art historian, and I think there's the book. One of the opening chapters of the book is it's set in the National Gallery of Scotland. And he's standing in front of a painting, and I think there's a kind of peace there, and certainly I know that in my in my work, I find peace in reading books, in going to art galleries, and trying not to think about sort of various conflicts for a bit.
Yeah. Well, Jude, he struck me very much as a man who's questioning what he does and how he does it, which gives him a lot of depth as a character. So
yes, and I think I suppose I had in mind. I mean, I've had various characters in my books, and I had in mind to create a character that I wanted to stick with for a while, and it seemed to me that having that questioning capacity was something that I can now continue to explore beyond the stranger. So I think we'll probably hear more from Jude.
Oh, excellent. Well, that was my final question. So we'll go back into some of the earlier questions.
Yeah.
I read an interview that you gave to The National where you said, "I've become really interested in the way terrorism works in a free market economy according to the law of supply and demand." Can I get you to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. I was in Kobani in Syria in 2015, and I crossed over from Turkey, and the city had been bombed very heavily, and Islamic State had pulled out back, and they were about 20, 30 kilometers south of the town. So I crossed over, which was quite unnerving, because suicide bomber blown themselves up a couple of weeks earlier at the crossing point. But anyway, got through, met up with some people there, and we went and had a look. And the place was rigged with improvised explosive devices, and they were being cleared, and a lot of them were being put in a quarry. They were basically big jars full of ammonium nitrate and aluminium paste. So the ammonium nitrate, the stuff that went off in Beirut, mixed up with aluminium paste to make it sort of more fierce, and 9-volt batteries, particular arrangement of wiring, and a pressure plate to set them off. So 2 years later, I'm in Fallujah in Iraq. It's an infamous city. And that is completely ringed by IEDs. And the IEDs are exactly the same manufacture and design. Now, that's about 600 kilometers apart. Those IEDs were not made in a central factory. They're improvised explosive devices. They are by their nature improvised, and yet there was a commonality of design, which suggested to me that there were factories, probably the length of the Euphrates Valley, that were, or not, maybe factories is the wrong word, workshops, so local workshops producing these things. So these are being produced on demand for Islamic State. At the same time, we know of reports, particularly from Pakistan, but also from Turkey, of certain madrasas producing disaffected young people as suicide bombers and as suicides, and providing them to these terrorist organizations, these militant groups, to then use them. So going back to what I was talking about earlier about these kids, the often in Afghanistan we've seen a lot of orphans brought up in madrasas in the tribal areas, and then moved across the border, and they end up being used as suicide bombers. And it's really not clear to what extent that they really understand what's happening. And certainly they have no conception of the broader world. So that's things like being able to buy a suicide bomber on the marketplace. And the same thing goes particularly, so in Iraq 2003, 2004, you saw vehicle chop shops that would weld a vehicle and fit it up so that a bomb could go in it, so it could become a vehicle-borne IED. And then the other thing is the financing, where you've got Islamic State reportedly having several hundred million in cryptocurrency holdings, because all the oil that was being sold in that 2012, 2014 period, all of that was just money going into Islamic State coffers. Antiquities were being sold as well. So you've got money being generated there in cryptocurrency holdings, and then you've got these different informal means of terrorist groups buying in the resources that they need in order to be able to undertake terrorist attacks. And that keeps them leaner. it keeps them leaner and smaller. They don't have to create these massive organizations. So you see the thing mutating. And there's a really excellent book by a guy called John Robb called Brave New War, which talks about a lot of this stuff. But I've certainly seen, I've seen evidence of it, and I've read about it as well. And I think it's quite worrying for the future, because you begin to realise, particularly with things like the dark web, that actually, and this, in the latter parts of the Stranger, you'll see this, the extent to which you can actually get from the internet the ingredients for almost anything you want. I mean, you can build a bomb from the internet. You can get on the internet and you can build a bomb from that. And if you're careful about where you buy the materials, no one's ever going to find out, frankly.
Yeah.
Until you blow it up.
Yeah. As the book progresses, one is more and more gripping it more and more rigidly with tension and fear. Partly because of this attention. I mean, anyone listening to you speaking right now, your stuff. These details. If an author gives me enough detail, as you did, I'm willing to follow them wherever they go. So if they then tell me something that they've made up, that's fine, because I'm in their zone. I want to ask you one possibly mad thing. There's a section in the Middle East and a character called the Old Man, and he has a female guard. And you even mentioned it earlier, I always think of that society as being really kind of separate, that the genders are kept apart. And I wondered if that is something that actually happens, or if that's something that you invented because she is important in the book.
I think a bit of both. There are certainly, I mean, someone like Gaddafi. I mean, albeit he was a secular leader, but Gaddafi in Libya, he had a female team of bodyguards around him. So regionally, it's not out of the question. And certainly, we've seen someone like Chechnya, the Black Widows. There were actively female combatants, and we have seen in some cases, certainly in Iraq and Syria, less so, but certainly of women as combatants and as suicides. So I don't think it's out of the question, certainly. And then the old man of the mountain, the Sheikh Al Jabal, is a mythical figure in kind of ancient Middle Eastern history. Actually, its origins are in Iran rather than in Iraq. But I took some license with that. There's a line in A Loyal Spy where one of the spy masters says the best lies are sandwiched between truths, and I think that's my sort of, as with espionage, I think with novel writing, my hope is to sort of, for you to believe it, because there's enough credible stuff there, and then I can slip the lies in, or slip the story in.
In between the facts. Another feeling I had as I was reading the book was this idea of never underestimate the charisma of a dangerous leader. I mean, there's a kind of I won't name names, but there are a few people out there right now, and there's some way they have of connecting with people to perpetuate their dangerous ideas. I mean, this is not...
I think we live in dangerous times. We live in the time of populism, and here we are the day after the first debate in the US elections, and there's this distinction between news and fake news. We see manipulation of the media. We see manipulation of imagery. We don't, we're approaching a time when we won't even really know whether, the person that we're talking to is actually a real person or a computer-generated image. And I was reading actually a really interesting John Lanchester article the other day talking about the extent to which we have godlike technology, but we're basically, we've only just got out of the trees. We're essentially this kind of hunter-gatherers, and we've got these huge godlike technology, and we just, it's so difficult for us to process that and understand it and understand what the impact is. I think I mean, one of the things that's so nice about coming home from the places that I work at is that essentially, and I think it's it's very true of Scotland. It's a civil place for the most part. People are actually pretty nice to each other, and that's we are part of a community really, and there's a strong spirit of that in Scotland, But you only have to look at Twitter to think to yourself, "My God, the place is full of lunatics." So I mean, I don't know. I think we're very vulnerable to charismatic leaders at the moment, and of course, the pleasure of that, if you're a novelist, is that writing charismatic leaders is actually quite fun, and I've always enjoyed writing about psychopaths. So I mean, it's a field day for people like me, but probably not so good for the rest of the world.
Well, the stranger in the stranger is just one such human being, and devastatingly effective, and just able to make people do whatever he wants, which is, in his case, quite dangerous. So, given the unpredictability of your day job, and all that entails, and the stresses and strains of it, when do you actually find time to write?
Yeah, well, it's not easy. I mean, it can sometimes be quite difficult to get into a flow. I mean, I try to write I try to write 500 words a day, which is not very much, frankly. But actually, over 200 days, you've got a book. So, and there are days when it doesn't happen. I write in the evenings. When I'm down in my cottage in Tinran, down near Moniaive in Dumfries, if I'm in the UK, I'll write in the evenings in the cottage. I also these days I write on planes, and sort of so I don't work on planes, as in I'm not going to do work, but I will write my book. Airport lounges, and yeah, but then sometimes if I'm not able to write for a few days, things will sort of steep in the back of my head, and then I can go at it when I do sit down, and often it will just flow. So that's good. And then I have I use an app that where I can store thoughts and connections and links to articles I've read, and it syncs across all my devices, so that helps as well. So I seem to be. I mean, the last couple of years writing I've found really quite relaxing. Actually, I've got to the point now where it feels like I can turn off work, not think about work, and actually write. And that it's a bit like watching a box set. I've sort of got to the point where writing feels comfortable enough to feel like you're, it's a restful activity. Whereas I used to find it quite hard when I started.
Yeah. And a question I usually ask crime writers, which is pertinent here, are you a pantser or a planner? How much of Jude's storyline do you know when you sit down, or does it just unfold on its own?
Yeah, I think I'm a pouncer. I mean, is that what you said, pouncer?
Pantser, by the seat of your pants, or a planner.
Oh, seat of your pants. I thought sort of, like, ah.
Oh, well, if you're a pouncer, that's your methodology. That's fine. Backs away.
I am increasingly seat of the pants, actually. So I'm doing less and less planning, but with quite a sense of I mean, generally a sense of where I'm going, increasingly on the fly, and actually, I think that seems to be working for me at the moment. As in, I think my books have got a bit more focus. Some of my earlier books, perhaps there's just too much information in there. You get a bit overloaded. I mean, some people love that, but I think if you're going to try and broaden your appeal, it's better to be possibly a bit more concise. And I think that seems to be a product of me being seat of my pants.
Well, it's working. You had me on the edge of my seat, on the seat of my pants as well. So
thank you.
So before we end this abbreviated lunchtime event, I'm curious, given your personal history of knowing the Middle East, having lived there, what's it like seeing places like Yemen and Syria being destroyed?
I mean, I found what happened to Syria and also actually, what's happened to Yemen it's quite shocking. I mean, if you see, for instance, drone footage of some of the Syrian cities, so Daraa in the south where we did some work, it looks like those images, from the Second World War of Berlin after the war. Just mile on mile of absolutely trashed buildings, and then of course these huge populations of refugees, people on the move, people without anywhere to live, ending up stuck in these borderlands in places between states often that are pretty lawless often. So that's very, I mean, it's shocking. It makes me intent to try and do something about it. Now, of course, I don't have the solution to anything, but we can try and certainly help clear up some of these, the unexploded ordnance, try and work through the rubble and stuff like that, so that hopefully one day people can get back to their homes. But it is pretty shocking, and it seems almost as if there's been a kind of decision taken in the last few years that it's actually, if you're ruthless enough and you're prepared to kill enough people, you can get away with it. And that was true, that was true in Chechnya, Putin's second invasion, true in Aleppo. The international community is not really going to do anything, and it's hard to blame the international community. If you look at where we have tried to do stuff in Iraq or whatever, that didn't really work out very well at all. So I don't feel like we're not very good at intervening. But I stare at some of these places and think, God, I wish somebody would do something to stop this happening. Yemen is it's appalling. And there's so many other, as with Syria, there's so many other players involved. There's so much geopolitical, so many different players, be it the Turks, the Russians, obviously, there's us, the US, the Americans, there's in Yemen, the Iranians, the Saudis, the UAE, the Sudanese, all of these different players, all with their own agendas, none of which, frankly, take into account in any way, shape or form the ordinary person who's living in those countries who and in the case of Yemen, they're getting hit by COVID, but they also got, massive cholera outbreak. They've got, nobody's got any clean water. They're getting bombed. It's pretty damn miserable. And I don't think it has to be like that. Actually, So for all the nasty things I've seen, I remain an optimist. I think it's better. It's possible for us to improve the world, but we need to be quite hard-nosed sometimes about how we do it, and we need to be careful about who we decide who our allies are sometimes.
Well, that's as good a place as any to leave it on a note of optimism and caution. Simon, this has been fascinating. You can buy The Stranger by just pressing a button and signing away. It's very simple. It's a fascinating book, and it will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.